Okay. Today we begin this seminar in macroeconomics in our course by Randall Ray. We know each other, I think, since '85. He is one of the most well-known post-Keynesians, but it's better probably to say financial economists, as Minsky would have said, around. He has written a lot. He's teaching at Kansas City, UMKC. He is a scholar of the Levy Institute, but I'm sure I pronounced badly Levy.
No, Levy is right.
Levy is okay. And he has published some fundamental books. One was Money and Credit in Capitalist Economies. When he was pretty young, I think was the dissertation with Minsky. And in it there was a kind of discourse not only on Minsky but also on this circuit approach with a kind of bridge between the two. Then he published Understanding Modern Money. And lately there is a book, Modern Money Theory. What I have asked him here is to talk essentially about Minsky, which is a huge topic. This means, of course, to go back to Keynes. Of course, modern money theory will come up here and there. I published yesterday the last version of the syllabus, the shortest that he provided. The important thing is that it is integrated with two publishing efforts by Randy, which are, in my view, very, very important. One is a book for Princeton University Press, which will appear later this year, hopefully in September, and the title explains it all. It is Why Minsky Matters. And the other one is, I think, an unpublished manuscript.
So far.
Published manuscript so far. But you know, for Marx, there is chapter 6 unpublished. And Giovanna Verto, a professor here, always asks me, but why you say unpublished since it is published? This unpublished manuscript will become a published book edited by Randy Ray, and the title is Reconstituting, and this happens, you have to say no, Reconstituting the Financial System, a Blueprint for a Successful Capitalism. The students have been provided with the paper printout of the drafts. They are drafts. They don't have to be distributed. But anyhow, they don't have to be distributed because they will become books. And I will recognize who of you distributed anyhow. He will explain maybe tomorrow how the exams and the grades will go on. Today, and maybe the next days, we will see. His plan is to give 3 installments of 40 minutes each, and in the end there will be a general discussion. Since these are lectures for students of this course, during the lectures, the students of the course may interrupt for clarification, when we will open the general discussion, they will be the first one that have to intervene, and I hope that you will intervene. After which, everybody who came to listen to Ray can intervene in the debate. I see only one student, I think, of mine from history of economic thought, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay. First year of the undergraduate program, so this is a success for you. Okay? Please.
All right. Usually I like to stand up, but I have a sore ankle, so I'm probably going to sit down today. The first couple of lectures are going to provide the background, theoretical background. I know probably most people are more interested in Minsky or maybe in modern money theory, but we have to do the background first, and I don't really know what you know because you're not my students, so I don't know how much background you have in macroeconomics. But to understand where Minsky comes from, you need to understand the theoretical background. So today I'm going to do the neoclassical approach and then Keynes's general theory. I hope everyone has read the general theory already in other classes, but maybe you haven't. So we do need to go through that because Minsky starts with the general theory, okay, and the debate between Keynes and the neoclassicals. Tomorrow, we're going to do the more modern macro theories, the mainstream theories that were developed after Keynes. So it'll be sort of macroeconomics after Keynes, which again is important to understanding Minsky because he's writing against all of the mainstream macro approaches, including the mainstream macro approaches that are called Keynesian, which are not Keynesian, okay, in Minsky's view anyway. So first, I always begin every class at every level with a distinction between the general framework or general orientation of two main approaches to economics. The orthodox neoclassical approach, which includes almost all economists today, and then the non-orthodox or heterodox approaches. So these are just the view of the world that economists come to economics with. The orthodox neoclassical approach begins with this view that there's a natural human nature. And that is that humans want to maximize pleasure, we call it utility, and avoid pain. That humans are naturally rational in a very specific sense, which is that they care about their own pleasure and pain and do not care about the pleasure and pain of others. Okay? That is rational. They are self-seeking, maximizing their own pleasure. Third, the analysis begins with the individual. And I don't know the Italian macro texts, but all of the English macro texts actually explicitly begin with individuals maximizing utility through time. Okay? So even macroeconomics begins with the individual. They assume rationality, and then the belief is that if you get the incentives right, free markets work. And they work in a very specific sense, that is, they drive toward equilibrium. Okay? And equilibrium has a very specific sense in macroeconomics. It is a vector of prices that clear all markets. There is a very small role for the government to play in the economy according to this view. Because for most things we can let the invisible hand of the market operate. The role for the government is to provide some things that markets don't provide very well, that markets don't provide enough of. And examples that are usually given are the policing, the military, some public goods that are not sufficiently supplied by private markets. But the general view is that we have far too much government. What we need to do is to reduce the role of the government in the economy, let the market work. So in the United States, this view really became dominant in the post-war period with President Reagan. I know that none of you were alive during the years of President Reagan, or Thatcher in England. This made a huge difference in society, where the argument was that we need to get the government off the backs of the people, we need to greatly reduce the role of the government in the economy. And Reagan was a Republican, a right-wing Republican, but this is also true for the more left Democrat candidates. President Clinton said virtually the same thing, that we need to reduce welfare and provide the proper incentives so that people will want to go work instead of just sitting back and collecting welfare. Okay? So we've had the gradual rise of what we call neoconservative in the US, and in Europe you usually call them neoliberals. George Bush called it the ownership society. I'll talk more about these when we get to the global financial crisis later in the course. Finally, there is a specific definition of economics that's given in the textbooks, I assume in yours too, that really summarizes very well this approach to economics. Economics is defined as the study of the allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants. And so I've underlined the important words here that really distinguish this approach to economics from the non-orthodox approach to economics. Okay, first, it's about allocating resources. You notice the word is not production of resources. The rigorous neoclassical theories actually don't even have production in them. It's all about exchange. Exchanging an endowment that you inherited. The theory actually doesn't explain where the endowment came from. You have an endowment of resources. We allow you to exchange in free markets. You have something that you don't want, but someone else has something you do want. You exchange. The market determines a vector of relative prices, okay, which clear all the markets. So demand equals supply. It's not really about producing resources. It's about allocating them. Second, the resources are scarce. Okay? If resources aren't scarce, the market cannot price them. So scarcity is essential. Resources must be scarce in order to have prices. The market can't do its job if resources aren't scarce. And finally, wants are unlimited. Okay? It's true that there's a diminishing marginal utility. Okay? You drink more and more beer. Okay? Eventually, the utility you get from drinking beer declines. But wants in general are unlimited. And this creates what's always called the economic problem, which it used to be the title of the very first chapter of every economics textbook. What's the economic problem? Wants are unlimited, resources are scarce. That means nobody can be fully satisfied. It's impossible. And this is why economics is called the dismal science, because we have to explain to people they cannot have what they want. Economics is all about explaining to people why they can't have what they want. Resources are scarce, wants are unlimited. Okay? So this framework lies behind the economic theorizing of virtually all economists. Okay? There is a second approach. It has a long history, but, the final thing. With marginal productivity, the argument is you can't get everything you want, but you get what you deserve. Marginal productivity theory says that people contribute to production, and then they receive back according to how much they contributed to production. And therefore, you get what you deserve. Okay?
Sorry, can I make a question?
Yep.
But the resources for the neoclassical and the marginal productivity theory, it means even for the money?
Well, there is a problem here. Okay? The rigorous theories have no production and no money. When we start adding production, things get a little fuzzier. When we add money, they get very fuzzy. Because in a rigorous general equilibrium model, there is no room for money. So Frank Hahn, one of the most famous developers of the GE theory, said, the problem is we can't find a reason to have money in our models. Okay?
I just
Yep.
want to get back. The most rigorous is the intertemporal general equilibrium approach of Arrow-Lebrun.
Yeah.
In that case, actually you don't need money because there is full certainty. Actually, in the first period of the economy, you have defined in all the horizons the path of the economy, supply and demand. There is no uncertainty, no reason to store money as a reserve and so on.
When you go on further and further in economics, you will do the Arrow-Lebrun model, and you will find out, it's sort of surprising, that there is no money in the rigorous models. Now, that doesn't mean that people who adopt the orthodox neoclassical approach say nothing about money. They write a lot about money. Okay? The problem is they really can't explain why money is used. Okay? If the economy operated in the way that the rigorous theory states. So they come up with ad hoc reasons for using money. All right? So it is a bit of a problem in their theory. Why is it that in the real world money is used? Now, if they just said, well, we have no room for money in our model, therefore we're not going to talk about it, who would listen to them? Okay. No policymakers, because in the real world we use money. In the real world we do have production. Okay? So you have to be able to say something about that. So they do address it, even though they admit they haven't come across a good explanation for why money exists. So it's an ad hoc approach to policy making. They have a lot to say about money, okay, and we'll do a little bit of it today and then more of it tomorrow on the role that money plays in the economy. All right, the other approach, the non-orthodox, a lot of people are now calling it the heterodox approach. My colleague Fred Lee played a role in pushing that terminology. In a way, it sounds better to say heterodox than non-orthodox, because non-orthodox, you're defining yourself as not being orthodox, which doesn't say a whole lot. It is the Keynesian institutionalist, but also I would say the Marxist approach. I'll be talking more about Keynesian institutionalists because Minsky was a Keynesian institutionalist. Okay? Here, the view is that there actually is no natural human nature. Human nature is shaped by institutions and by culture. In other words, our nature is developed. There's nothing natural about it. And it will be different depending on which society you're looking at. There's nothing natural about selfishness. Selfishness is created, okay, by society. Some societies favor selfishness. And so when you live in a capitalist economy, it seems pretty obvious that people are fairly selfish. But there's nothing natural about that at all. It is reinforced by the kinds of institutions we have in capitalism. All right? So, behavior is largely socially determined, and the culture of the society in which you live matters a lot. So there is no universal human nature. look at tribal society, people behave very differently than they do in a capitalist society. Many or most decisions are not rational in the neoclassical sense. Okay? They are not individuals maximizing their own self-interest. There are two reasons for that. One is that humans actually are social creatures. They actually do care about other individuals, both in a good sense and in a bad sense. Okay? In a good sense, they want to help others, but also in a bad sense, they want to hurt others. Okay? And they get pleasure from that. Kenneth Boulding, who's a very famous institutionalist economist, used to say, you know, the neoclassical theory, it's so naive, but in a way it's beautiful. Nobody wants to hurt anybody else. He says, you know, you couldn't possibly conceive of a theory of humans that could be so far wrong. Okay? So both in the good sense, they want to help others, but in the bad sense, they actually get enjoyment from inflicting pain on other people. That's not allowed in the neoclassical model. But the second reason why they can't be rational in the neoclassical sense is that the future is truly uncertain. You don't know. Okay? We could say that you sort of know the present, and you have some idea about the past, but even the past is uncertain. But you have a great deal of uncertainty about the future. You cannot know the future because it's yet to be created. It's impossible to know the future. Okay? Literally impossible. Now, you can make predictions, you have expectations about the future, but it is truly uncertain. And then finally, power, discrimination, prejudice, segregation, all these things really matter. And this gets back to the humans actually enjoy hurting others, rising above others, dominating others, and those things really matter. And if you exclude all of these things from your analysis, which neoclassical theory does, you miss a lot about the economy. Power matters. Orthodoxy starts with the assumption of perfect competition. So many buyers, so many sellers, nobody can influence the market. In the real world, that doesn't describe virtually any market. Okay? In the real world, power matters. And finally, our definition of economics, completely different. So I've highlighted two important differences. It's the study of the social creation and social distribution of society's resources. Okay? Social creation, so resources don't just exist. You don't inherit them at your birth. They aren't given like manna from heaven. They're socially created. Okay? They're created, but the creation is mostly social. Yes, you can individually produce some things, but that describes almost nothing of modern society, or even in tribal society. Virtually everything is socially created. You work together in groups, but even more than that, the knowledge is socially created. Okay? It's almost impossible to conceive of production being individually undertaken. Okay? And second, the distribution is socially determined. It's not determined by markets. It's not determined by an invisible hand. It is not determined by your contribution to production. It's not the marginal productivity that you contributed. It's socially determined. Okay? By what? Well, by power, discrimination, prejudice. All of those things matter. Okay? Why is it that in capitalist economies we observe that men earn more than women? Are they more productive? No. This is socially determined. Okay? Yep.
I haven't understood the meaning of social into the definition. You can repeat, please.
Well, individual production would be undertaken by an individual who created his or her own knowledge. Okay? It wasn't inherited from society. It wasn't as a result of social education and training. They came up with the ideas completely on their own, and they're able to produce something on their own. That describes almost nothing. Social creation means that you grew up in a society where you were educated, trained, socialized, we use that term, right? What is parenting? It's socializing these little creatures. Okay? In what sense are we socializing them? We're socializing them so that they fit into the society they're born into. Okay? That's socialization. And then finally, the production is undertaken socially. Okay? If you go to a modern office, if you're a white-collar worker, or a modern factory where you're a blue-collar worker, you're working in teams. And if you did not cooperate with others, work together, you would produce nothing. It requires working together to produce. Okay? And almost always under some kind of a management that allocates tasks to individuals, each one producing just a tiny part of the task. Okay? Adam Smith's pen factory is a 200-year-old example of the social process of producing pens. All right, now let me just allocate different schools of thought to these two different views of society. So in the Orthodox, we would include the various neoclassical approaches to economics. And here, the modern school, the two main modern schools of thought would be the New Classical. This is Lucas. Okay? This begins in the early 70s. And the real business cycle approach of, let's say, Plosser. This begins more like in the 1980s. So these are the two dominant neoclassical approaches. We can also include the supply side economics, which was very popular under Reagan and Thatcher. Okay? Which is, it's really just an extreme neoclassical approach in which the supply side dominates. We don't need to go into this in great detail because neoclassical economics by its nature is really a supply side approach. It's just that these people made it super supply side. So how do you stimulate the economy? How do you get economic growth? You stimulate the supply side. What is the supply side? The extremely rich. So you take from the poor and give to the rich, and then things trickle down and you get economic growth. And also the Austrians, I would include in the neoclassical approach, although they do deviate from the other neoclassical approaches in a few ways. One is the treatment of time, the other is the treatment of uncertainty. Their treatment of time and uncertainty are closer to the Keynesian approach. Also, in the Orthodox approach, I would include what is usually called the Keynesian approach. But the Keynesian approach is mostly the neoclassical Keynesian approach of Samuelson. Okay? It's also called the neoclassical synthesis. Samuelson didn't even want to use the name Keynesian in the approach. This was probably mostly for political reasons. In the United States, we had the McCarthy period. I don't know if that means anything to you, but it was a reaction against communists. And Samuelson was very afraid that using the term Keynesian would lead to trouble because it was associated bizarrely with communism. Okay? Neoclassical synthesis, or Keynes of the textbooks, so I usually call it textbook Keynesianism. It was based on the ISLM model that was developed by Hicks in 1937. I also include the new Keynesians. So the new Keynesians is the third very important modern school in macroeconomics. New classical, real business cycle, and new Keynesian. But I include new Keynesians as a branch of neoclassical economics for the most part, and it's within the orthodox approach. Finally, the new monetary consensus, which is trying to synthesize the new classical and the new Keynesian with a different version of a model that is sort of like ISLM. I'll say a few words about it later. Okay, so in other words, all of the modern orthodox approaches adopt that first approach to economics that I was talking about, based on individuals, rationality, utility maximization, small role for the government. These approaches do disagree on exactly how small the government needs to be. New Keynesians will accept a bigger government, let's say, than new classicals will accept. But it is still, there's still enough similarities that I group them all together. In the other branch, the other view of economics, let's call it heterodox or non-orthodox, we have three main schools of thought. The first is the institutionalist approach, which is a really mostly originally an American approach to economics. It was developed by Veblen in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and then carried on by John R. Commons. These names probably won't mean too much to you because, again, was very American. And then finally, John Kenneth Galbraith, who maybe you have heard of, and on to his son, Jamie Galbraith, and then a whole school of thought that has spread to Europe in various institutionalist groups. So there is some presence of institutional economics now outside the United States. Somewhat surprisingly, in the United States, until 1960, from World War II until 1960, the institutionalist school actually was dominant in policymaking, partly because John Kenneth Galbraith was such an important person in American politics. But it really lost ground to the neoclassical Keynesians. So the 1960s are usually called the Keynesian era. That's when the neoclassical Keynesians took over policymaking in the US. The second heterodox approach is the Keynes and post-Keynesian approach. So here I need to distinguish between Keynes of the textbooks and Keynes of the general theory. So this is Keynes of the general theory, and his followers, people like Koleski and Robinson, and in the modern era, people like Paul Davidson, Hyman Minsky, and Jan Kregel. Finally, the Marxist approach, which of course it comes from Marx, and from Lenin, from Stalin, and Dobb later, and Sweezy in the modern period. So I would say these schools of thought all accept that second approach to economics. In the remainder of this segment, before we take a short break, I'm going to just quickly remind you of the neoclassical model, neoclassical approach. I expect all of you have studied this in both micro and macro. So let's look at what determines employment, output, interest rates, and the prices. So we begin with the labor market. And keep that in mind. Very important. You begin your analysis with the labor market. The labor market gives you full employment at a price clearing wage, a real wage. Okay? So the market will be cleared because the wage is flexible. And it's a real wage, not a money wage. And I say this is very important because when we get to Keynes, you'll see his first significant chapter, chapter 2, begins with the labor market, just like they do. And he's going to disagree with this analysis. Okay? So we have labor demand. Firms want to employ people. Okay? Why do they want them? Because they're productive. And the firm is willing to pay them a real wage equal to the value of their marginal product. Okay? So the labor demand curve slopes down. At a lower real wage, firms will hire more. Okay? And it slopes down because there's diminishing marginal product of labor. There's a labor supply curve. Why do people want to work? Well, there's a labor-leisure trade-off. You would rather have leisure. People are naturally lazy, according to this view. I'm not saying they are. According to this view. They're naturally lazy. But we can induce them to work to get a wage. Do they want a wage? Well, they don't really want a wage. They want to consume. Because when they're consuming, they get utility. The higher the wage, the more they'll work. Okay? Now, we normally assume that the substitution effect dominates over the income effect. I hope you remember what that is. We're not going to go through it. But if the income effect dominated, we wouldn't get a nice upward sloping curve. But we assume that the income effect doesn't dominate. So at a higher wage, you will always work more hours. Okay? It's probably not true in reality. Empirical evidence says that it's not. Beyond some income level, you'll actually take more leisure. Okay? But let's ignore that and assume that it's upward sloping. Then as long as the wage is flexible, we can find a real wage that clears the labor market. By definition, that must be full employment. That's why it's labeled NF. Okay? So unless we have a minimum wage law or we have labor unions that prevent the wage from falling, the market is going to clear. And that means, by definition, we've got full employment with a flexible wage. Okay? We take the full employment level of output, apply it to a production function, which is a technical relationship, and that gives us the full employment level of output. Okay? So technology plus the amount of employment determined in the labor market give us the full employment level of output. As long as we have flexible wages, we will produce as much as we're capable of producing given full employment in the labor market and our technology. Now, of course, technology could improve, and that will shift our production function up, and we'll get more output. Okay? But otherwise, this is the best we can do. Given our technology and given our labor force, the preference for labor over leisure, the productivity of our labor force, this is the best we can do. And the free market should be able to get us here if we don't have frictions in the labor market. Okay? Let's move to the second market. The interest rate. The interest rate is determined in the loanable funds market. The supply of loanable funds comes from savers. At a higher interest rate, savers are willing to save more. When they're saving, they're postponing consumption. To get them to postpone consumption, you have to pay them interest. Otherwise, they'll consume everything today. But to get them to postpone some consumption, you need to reward them with interest. The higher the interest rate, the more they will postpone consumption. Okay? So, saving supply of loanable funds is a function of the interest rate you pay them and their thriftiness. In neoclassical economics, we don't really try to explain the thriftiness of people. We assume that there is a positive rate of time preference, which means you have to be rewarded in order to postpone consumption. Then there is a demand for loanable funds. That is a function of the marginal product of capital. So here firms will borrow loanable funds to buy capital, and the amount they're willing to pay depends on the marginal product of capital. So that is downward sloping. The intersection of those two determines equilibrium, which is an equilibrium interest rate. So if we have free markets in loanable funds, the market will find the price to clear the supply and demand. And that price is an interest rate. At that interest rate, investment equals saving. Okay, what ensures that investment equals saving? A flexible interest rate. As long as the interest rate is flexible, we will establish equilibrium between the supply of loanable funds, which is saving, and the demand for loanable funds, which is investment. All right? Now this model is based only on the private market. If thriftiness changes, the supply curve can change. If the marginal product of capital changes, the demand curve can change. Let's just look at one example. If people suddenly become more thrifty, okay, they have a higher propensity to save in order to consume in the future, the saving supply curve shifts out. That will give us more investment because the interest rate is driven down, and more saving, so we reach a new equilibrium point where investment equals saving at a lower interest rate. If thriftiness declines, the curve shifts the other direction, and the interest rate goes up and investment and saving go down. If the marginal product of capital changes, the investment demand curve can change. Here we had marginal product of capital going up, investment demand curve shifts up, the interest rate goes up, the higher interest rate induces more saving, we have a higher level of investment and saving. Okay? Now let's add the government. So far we just had a closed economy with no government. There are two extensions we can make. I'm only going to do one of them. We can add in a government sector. What happens if the government runs a deficit? And this is important for understanding the debates about deficits, which in the orthodox approach are mostly a bad thing. Okay, why are they bad? Well, because they lead to crowding out. So let's have our initial point of equilibrium. Now the government runs a deficit. A deficit is an additional demand for loanable funds. So we had investment as a demand for loanable funds. Now we also have the deficit as a demand for loanable funds, so it shifts the curve out. That drives up the interest rate. We reach a new equilibrium, which is saving equals investment plus the deficit. Okay? There's an equality here. We'll see there's also an equality in the Keynesian approach, but it's different. That is ensured by the interest rate being driven up. Now, as the interest rate goes up, people save more. If they save more, they're consuming less. As the interest rate goes up, investment is also lower. So the cost to the economy of the government deficit is that investment declines by this amount because of the rising interest rate, and consumption declines by this amount because saving has risen. So we get a decline of consumption and a decline of investment that is equal to the increase of government spending. So increasing government spending by deficits leads to less consumption and less investment. This is why deficits are generally seen to be a bad thing. All right? When we look at the heterodox approach, we're going to see that the conclusions are completely different from this. Even though we're going to have the same equality of investment and deficit. All right. In neoclassical economics, I already said that it is generally supply-driven. The idea is that supply creates its own demand. Okay, so this is attributed to Say, and this is going to be another thing that Keynes attacks. The idea is that production of output generates an equal amount of income and hence demand. It is much like a barter economy where the act of supplying one good implies a demand for another, and money is merely a medium of exchange that makes no difference. There are strong and weak versions of Say's law. The strong version is supply creates its own demand, and the market ensures that you will be at full employment. Okay, the weak version is the supply creates its own demand, but there's no guarantee that it will be at full employment. The straight old neoclassical theory had the strong version because you have flexible wages. The more modern neoclassical new Keynesian approach would have the weak version. Supply creates its own demand, but it may not be full employment because you can have rigidities in the labor market so that wages don't clear the market. Okay? So we have Say's law, supply creates its own demand. We're going to see that Keynes turns this on its head. Keynesian economics is demand-driven. Neoclassical economics is supply-driven. All right? So in neoclassical economics, the argument is that if you hire factors of production in order to produce something, you must create enough income so that it can be bought. So that's sort of the logic that drives Say's law. And it makes some kind of sense. All right? Marx found a problem with this, and then later Keynes found a problem with this. All right. What role does money play in this economy, in this approach to the economy? We start with the quantity theory of money, which begins with an identity. There's a Fisher version, which was replaced by the more modern income version. In the Fisher equation, we say that money, which is a stock, times velocity of money, which everyone always says, you can think of this as the number of times a euro can be spent over the course of the year, is equal to the overall price level times the total amount of transactions over the course of the year. This is an identity. It must be true. Okay? And in fact, the way that we determine velocity is just through this equation. Okay, we can measure the money stock, we can get a measure of the overall price level, and we measure the number of transactions that occurred over the course of the year, and we solve the equation for velocity. Okay, so that's how we actually do it. So this is an identity. In the income version, we substitute Y, which is income, for transactions. The difference between these two is that we're leaving out financial transactions. Okay? So the Fisher version would include if I buy stocks or bonds, that's a transaction. The income version leaves that out, ignores it. The only thing that matters is gross domestic product. Okay? We know that that equals gross national income. So we're leaving out all financial transactions. The idea then, because it's an identity by itself, it means nothing. But to give us some theoretical force, we need to make some arguments about these variables. So income, we say, is mostly supply determined. It's determined by the full employment level of employment applied to the production function. that gives us real output. Okay, so that the market I showed you before for real output. Velocity is determined by institutional factors, and this is, in the short run, more or less fixed. Over time, velocity could rise, it could fall, but over a short period, it's fairly constant. Finally, the quantity of money is assumed to be controlled by the central bank. Okay, and we'll talk more about this later in the week. So, if we assume that real output tends to grow at a technologically determined rate plus growth of the labor force, we can say that real output, real income tends to grow at a fairly constant rate. Let's say it's somewhere between 2 and 4% per year. The money supply is controlled by the central bank, and velocity is controlled by institutional factors. Then, if velocity is fairly constant, let's say growing at 0 or near 0, then the growth of the money supply minus the growth of income will determine the growth of prices. All right? And so, with these assumptions, we can reach the conclusion that Milton Friedman reached, which is that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. In other words, it's determined by the central bank's choice of money supply growth. If real income grows at 4%, velocity is constant, the money supply grows at 6%, we can calculate that inflation will be 2% per year. It's determined by the central bank's policy choice. So the quantity of money determines the price level, and the growth of the quantity of money determines the growth of the price level, or what we call inflation. There's a third approach, which is the Cambridge approach, which essentially just moves velocity to the other side. Okay, so 1 over v equals k. The difference is that they formulated this in terms of a money demand and money supply approach, which came after Keynes had introduced the notion of liquidity preference and money demand. So here, we need an equality between money demand and money supply. That equality can be regained after an increase in money supply by having money demand rise. Money demand can rise either because prices have risen or because real output has risen. So now we have a possibility for output to also be impacted by money supply. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Summarize. Here's a one-page summary of the neoclassical model. Upper left quadrant is where we start. That's our labor market. That determines the real wage and the full employment level of employment. We go down to our production function. That determines real output. Okay. We move up to the right, upper right corner. That gives us our interest rate and our equilibrium level of investment and saving. And then finally, we move down to something like a budget line for the economy as a whole, which is a division of total output between consumption output and investment output. Okay? And so the division between investment and consumption is determined in the loanable funds market, and we can come down and we can read off the lower right-hand quadrant, the amount of investment and the amount of consumption. Okay, so it's all determined right here. Everything except the price level, which we go back to the quantity equation to get the price level from the amount of money. modern economic textbooks have moved on to an aggregate supply and aggregate demand framework. I don't like this, but because it's presented in your textbooks just very quickly, they wanted to put price and output on the two axes. So we have an aggregate demand curve, which is a function of the money supply, and an aggregate supply curve, which is fixed at the full employment level of output. The intersection of those two determine the price level, and then if the money supply goes up, the price level rises. Okay? So what does money do? It determines the price level. So this is just a graphical representation of the quantity equation. Changing aggregate demand can only change prices in the long run. Conclusion. Supply factors such as technology, population, tastes determine the real variables. The nominal variables don't matter. We have a production function plus a labor market that determines employment and output. The interest rate is determined in loanable funds market, where it is thriftiness, which is preferences, and technology, which is marginal product of capital, determine the interest rate. Demand doesn't matter for real variables. It can affect the nominal variables. We assume perfect competition, perfectly flexible wages and prices, and perfect information. Now, take a few questions and answers if there are any, and we'll take a short break. And then I'll start presenting Keynes' response to this. Do we have any questions about this model? Okay.
You about income. Income create full employed. Do you know this model?
Income creates full employment.
Yeah. If there is another character.
Well,
you mean say slow, the fact that production is distributed as income, and income gives way to a demand which is equal to income. Is this what you are asking about?
No, because he said it's the income to create full employed in the back in the slide.
well, it's full employment determines that amount of income. Okay, we've hired everyone willing to work. Whoops, there it is. Why didn't that work? There we go. Upper left-hand side. Anyone who's willing to work at that real wage, W over PE, anyone willing to work at that wage is working. So by definition, that's full employment. Okay? We're paying all of them this real wage. So multiply this real wage by that number of people working, that tells us what total income is.
Okay. So, well,
Okay, you can think. And
We do a break now of how much?
5.
5 minutes. We begin. There will be office hours if you want to talk with him. There will be 2. One with this week and the other next week. They will be both at 1:30 p.m. So, like neoclassicals, you have to look at utility to talk with Professor Ray or go eating. It is one on Friday, 1:30, this Friday. The next one will be on Thursday, 1:30. The second thing is that I remind everybody that there is more people than usual here, so that's good. that Professor Ray will do lectures until next Friday. But on Monday, 4:30, 7:30, there will not be a formal lecture. There will be a presentation of a movie documentary by Terry Jones, Boom, Bust, Boom. It will be in English, maybe with English subtitle, maybe with Italian subtitles, maybe with no subtitle at all. I don't know yet. I have the written English subtitle. I have to see the movie on myself this afternoon and to check the subtitles. I doubt that they are okay. If Mehdi wants to come with me, we can see and check the Italian subtitles. It is, in my view, an important thing. Randy Ray is one of the economists who has been interviewed in this movie, because it is the first screening, I think it is the English term, of the movie in Italy, which of course is a private screening, only for the staff and the students of this university. Then I will diffuse the information only within this university and in the Facebook page of this course, Economics and Global Markets. You can tell to friends if you wish. That's it. At the end of these 3 installments, I will take a few minutes to build a bridge on what we said in our course before, and this may be useful to him, to remind him what we did. He knew already, but I understand that he does not have to remind our program until now. Okay.
All right. So I divided it into 3 because we had to do the neoclassical, and then I want to do the general theory. Normally, I would spend 6 hours on the general theory, and we can't afford 6 hours. So we have less than 2, which means I have to condense it and also talk a little bit fast, so you're going to need a break in the middle of this. I'll do the first half, take a short break, then do the second half. So, Keynes's first chapter is famous for being so short, but he makes 2 important points here. One is that he's arguing that he's providing a theory of the determination of employment and output as a whole. Okay? And that this was very different from what he did in his previous book, The Treatise on Money, which maybe you are not so familiar with it, but it was an extremely important book that came out in 1930. As soon as he finished it, he wrote to his friends, I'm already realizing that it's completely inadequate. Okay, so he started a new book immediately. He knew he had made a big mistake. The big mistake was, in the treatise, he took the level of employment and output as a whole as given. And essentially, this is what neoclassical economics does. Because neoclassical economics assumes you're at the full employment level of output. Okay? That's guaranteed by your labor market dominating. Here, Keynes says, I need a theory of the determination of employment and output as a whole. It might not be full employment. So that is why this deviates so much from the treatise, but also from all the economics that was being done at the time. The model that I just presented you, the neoclassical model, is what Keynes was attacking in the general theory. That's the model he was attacking. That model was not presented so clearly as I just presented it to you. Keynes actually had to create that model for them. He said, okay, this is what you must believe to reach the conclusions that you reach. So Keynes actually created that model and made it coherent. Okay? And then said, this is what's wrong with it. So he was specifically attacking that model. So he says, a footnote. Whenever Keynes says classical, he doesn't mean classical. He means neoclassical. This is extremely confusing. Nowadays, when we say classical, we mean the line of thought that goes from Smith, actually a bit before Smith, to Marx. So classical economics is Marxian economics. Okay, Smith to Marx. Smith, Ricardo, Marx are the three most important people. Keynes doesn't mean that at all, although he attacks Ricardo in the book. He's focusing on a different aspect. He's focusing on neoclassical economics.
He just the reason of the naming classical by John Maynard Keynes was that he took the dividing line being the acceptance or not of Say's law. From this point of view, Ricardo and Barras are on the same side. Another thing is the theory of value. So let us say some values say labor theory of value versus utility theory of value. Some others say would say objective theories of value against objective theories of value. So this is why in Europe we are accustomed more to this idea that classicals are from Petti actually to Ricardo and maybe Marx. That's the point.
Yeah. So anyway, always substitute neoclassical when you're reading it. So he says, the classical full employment case that we just went through before the break is just a special case of the general theory. It's just a special case where you happen to be at full employment. There are no market forces that will take you there, okay? And we'll explain why over the next 2 hours. The general case is one in which changing views about the future influence the level of employment and not simply where employment is directed. In neoclassical theory, you're at full employment. The labor market ensures that. And then other forces will determine what you produce, okay? Whether you produce more widgets or more something else. So that's what he's referring to here. Finally, the postulates of the neoclassical case are not just special, they're dangerous if you try to apply them to the real world. Neoclassical theory is dangerous because it assumes you're always at full employment. And his argument is that that's only a special case, very unlikely to be achieved in the real world. Chapter 2, as I said, it's very strange that he starts off chapter 2 with the labor market and with the neoclassical labor market. Okay, so here I've redrawn it exactly the way they would draw it. And Keynes says, there are two main postulates about the determination of employment in the neoclassical model. The first is that the wage equals the marginal product of labor. Nothing new there. That's your labor demand curve. So you must be on your labor demand curve. The second, the wage equals the marginal disutility of working. That sounds strange, but he's saying exactly the same thing. There's a labor-leisure decision. You don't really want to work. You'd rather have leisure, but you also want to consume. So that's all he's saying, labor supply curve. They assume both of these, and that means that you are at that point of equilibrium, which means you're at full employment. Okay? And Keynes is going to say, I agree with one of these, but I don't agree with the other one. He's going to say, I will agree that you're on your labor demand curve, but I'm going to disagree that you're normally on your labor supply curve. Okay? So he rejects the second postulate. He says, then he provides some arguments as to why he rejects the second postulate. And I have to admit to you, I find them extremely weak arguments. They're largely based on observations about the real world. They could be true, okay, but as you know, economists are not necessarily convinced by arguments that are based on observing the real world. Just because it seems to be true, that's usually not enough. So I find these to be weak arguments and sort of a strange way to begin your book. It says workers care about their relative wage, not the real wage. By relative, he means relative to other workers. You get really upset if someone else earns more than you. Okay? And so you're always trying to get a wage better than other people. Okay? So the relative is what matters to you, not the real wage. That is, wage over the price level. Second, he says, in any case, workers don't bargain over their real wage. Okay? The neoclassical assumption was that workers are paying attention to the real wage, and that is what they bargain over. He says in the real world you don't. You bargain for 10 euros per hour as your wage. Inflation might turn out to be higher than you expected or lower than you expected. Okay? You might get a real wage that's higher than you thought it would be or lower than you thought it would be. But there's nothing you can do about that. You bargain over a nominal wage, not a real wage. So the real wage is not determined in a wage bargain. It depends on how inflation turns out to be. He says, but I will accept the argument that you're on the labor demand curve so that the real wage must equal the marginal product of labor. So what he's saying is we could be anywhere on the red part of the labor demand curve. We might possibly be at the point where it crosses labor supply. That's full employment. But we could be up to the left, okay, where we're not clearing the labor market, where the real wage, at the real wage that exists, there are people who are unemployed because they are willing to work for that wage, but they can't obtain that wage. All right? Now, this has led to a lot of critique of Keynes by heterodox economists. Because we've known from Straffa, actually we knew before that, but Straffa made it extremely clear that there is a big problem in trying to get to get a nice, smooth relationship between the real wage and the quantity of labor. Okay? This is the Cambridge controversies that we'll talk briefly about and maybe you've heard about. So a lot of heterodox economists don't like this. And in fact, in the general theory, there are 3 places where Keynes seems to accept a neoclassical supply and demand approach. Here's one of them. He accepts it at least for the demand part of the labor market. Another place is when he talks about money demand and money supply in chapters 13 and 15, where it seems like he says the demand and supply of money determines the interest rate. So this also led to an attack by heterodox economists, the so-called horizontalists, against Keynes. And then the third place is in the capital market, where Keynes seems to say that the interest rate determines the quantity of investment. And it sounds a lot like the marginal product of capital theory. If you squint your eyes and read the text in a particular way, you can get this interpretation. So a lot of Straffians attack Keynes for seeming to accept a supply and demand approach to capital. So there are 3 places in the general theory where he uses supply and demand analysis and is subject to critiquing by heterodox economists. In my view, all 3 of these were a mistake. They were a diversion. Keynes never should have put them in. He should not have accepted the labor demand curve, okay? Because there were problems in it, and Keynes knew there were problems with it. Why did he do it? He thought that it might be easier to explain things. And he actually was pushed by some of his young colleagues to do it in supply and demand. Said, look, everyone understands supply and demand. Just say what you want to say and use supply and demand analysis. So Keynes did that. But it was a mistake. All right? So I think all of this right here is really a diversion.
So you're basically saying that he was trying to get through with his arguments.
Yes. And Keynes, always had this strategy of deviating as little as was necessary to make your argument. Okay, accepting as much of whatever someone believed in order to make your argument. Okay, rather than attacking them on everything they believed, saying completely wrong. Say no. Okay, I can accept this, but this part I won't accept. That's what he's doing right here. I can accept your labor demand argument. I won't accept the labor supply.
But it ended up with people like Davidson that they took it too seriously.
Well, I think Davidson is okay on this one.
On this one.
On this one, yeah. I think he had more problems with the horizontalists and the Straphians. Okay, then he goes on to define what he means by involuntary unemployment. Now he's starting to get into the important stuff. He says, let's define. If a small increase in the price of wage goods at the existing nominal wage, what he's saying is, if prices go up and that lowers the real wage, if that leads to more employment, there must have been involuntary unemployment. Okay? Why is that? Because you're lowering the real wage and so firms will hire more. That means that there were workers willing to work at that nominal wage and couldn't get a job. Or alternatively, here's the better way of stating it. If an increase of aggregate demand increases employment, then there was involuntary unemployment. We don't need the labor market curve at all. He's just saying, if aggregate demand goes up and we observe that firms hire more workers, the problem was on the demand side. Okay? There were workers willing to work at the going wage, but they couldn't get a job because aggregate demand was too low. So this is the way he should have started the argument. We have a problem of effective demand. Demand is too low. That's why we have unemployment. All right? And then he goes on. He says there are three equivalent ways of stating the neoclassical assumption. First, the real wage equals the marginal disutility of work. That is, you're on your labor supply curve. Second, there is no involuntary unemployment. You're at the point of equilibrium. Third, Say's law. Supply creates its own demand. But then he phrases it differently from the way that Say would. The whole of the cost of production must be spent in aggregate on purchasing the output. All of the cost of production, so all the expense of hiring the factors of production, returns to the capitalists. All of it gets spent. All right? So he says, these all amount to the same thing. They all mean the same thing. But it requires that the demand price of output as a whole is equal to its supply price for all levels of output and employment. He throws this in here and you have no idea what he's talking about. And he does this frequently in the general theory. Because this is what he's going to do later in the book. So you don't know what he means when he says the demand price of output. What is that? Supply price of output. What is that? For all levels of output and employment. Okay? Now he's going to introduce his D and Z curves. And what he's saying is that the D curve lies on top of the Z curve, which is what Say's law is all about. Supply equals demand, no matter what the level of employment. Okay, he's going to say that that's not in general true. That's a special case, which doesn't exist in the real world, most likely. The general case is the demand and supply curves at the aggregate level, what he calls D and Z curves, are not on top of one another. So unemployment is the normal result. All right? So it's not clear, but in chapter 3 he starts to present the principle of effective demand. So in my view, the book would have been better if he had started with chapter 3, forget the chapter 2, because it led to this view that, Keynes accepts marginal productivity theory, which we know from Straffa is completely flawed. And Keynes knew it was flawed. Okay. All right, chapter 3. The principle of effective demand. He defines an aggregate supply curve So this is the supply curve for the economy as a whole. And Keynes is not aggregating up from individual firms. Okay, so he's not just adding up to get aggregate. It's a completely different concept. The aggregate supply price, or Z, is the expected proceeds required to induce entrepreneurs to supply that level of output. So it is how much the entrepreneurs would have to get to employ that amount of labor in the aggregate. It's what they must get to employ that number of workers. Then there's a D curve. The proceeds expected from the employment of that number of workers. These sound similar, but one is how much you must get, the other is how much you expect to get. Okay? If the D curve is above the Z curve, there's an incentive to increase employment. Do I have one of those kind of pens you can write with?
Yes. Good. Yeah.
So I'll just do that quickly over here. So here are the I don't know. Okay. We've got a D curve and a Z curve. So, to employ this number of workers, entrepreneurs in the aggregate would have to get this amount of sales. Okay, proceeds. But they expect they'll get this amount. You can see they're getting more than they need. So there's an incentive to hire more workers. How much will they hire? Well, we can go up the curve here, up to here. It always makes sense to employ more workers because you expect to get more than you need to get. Once you reach this point, it makes no sense to hire more workers. Because beyond, you need to get this amount, but you're only getting this amount. So you're not getting as much as you need to get to justify hiring that number of workers. So this right here will be the number you will employ at the aggregate level. Okay? There's no reason to believe this is full employment because we're not beginning with the labor market. So you can reduce Keynes' general theory to one sentence, which is firms hire the amount of labor they think they need to produce the amount of output they think they will get. And they won't hire more than that. It's not rational for a firm to hire more workers than they need to produce the amount of output they think they can sell.
Of course, with the due uncertainties,
Everything is uncertain.
we have to consider a reasonable distance between them. So D has to be so much higher that even with the due uncertainties, then I'll get at least the Z.
That's right. So in Minsky, you'll see we will discount this, okay, because we're uncertain about it. But yes, the difference from neoclassical, all of these are forward-looking, okay, and therefore they are uncertain. It's what we expect to get, expected, but we don't know. All right? He says, okay, now, going back to what he said at the very end of chapter 2, it starts to make sense. He says, the classicals assume that D equals Z for every level of employment. That is Say's law. And any time Z rises, D will rise by the same amount. In other words, any Z must have an effective demand associated with it. Okay. No matter how much firms produce, no matter what the supply is, demand will be high enough. All right? The D curve lays on top of the Z curve. They're identical. We don't know exactly what they look like, but they're identical. Okay? Keynes says no. Where the demand curve crosses the Z curve, that determines employment. And there's no reason to believe that that's full employment. It's just the point of effective demand. It's the rational amount of labor to employ at the aggregate level. Because expected proceeds equal needed proceeds. All right. In the next 3 chapters, he said, I had some very difficult decisions to make. Okay? On my choice of units, on how I treat expectations, and on how I measure income. And these, for the most part, aren't too interesting, but there are some interesting things that he states here. So one is, he said, I had to choose the unit of measurement. Okay? And except for homogeneous output, the only common unit of measure is the money value and the employment unit. The reason this is interesting is because the classical economists reached exactly the same conclusion.
Classicals.
The true classicals. Okay, Marx, labor theory of value. If you read Keynes, his arguments are exactly the same as the classicals from Petty to Marx.
There is a footnote.
Well, this is...
By Keynes.
Oh, yeah. So, chapter 4, he says, and for exactly the same reason, I'm coming to the same conclusion that we have to use labor hours or money value. And I can reduce that to the wage unit. So the wage unit and hours, those are the only measurements I'm going to use. Okay? Second, how am I going to treat expectations? Well, this is important because there's a difference between your short-term expectations and your long-term expectations. And in chapter 12, he'll use this. So in the short term, you're stuck with the capital equipment you have. So your short-term expectations are about using the capacity you already have. Long-term expectations are about the longer run where you have a choice of increasing your capacity. So long-term expectations have to do with, should I increase my capacity in purchasing more capital? He says, finally, today's employment is governed by today's expectations and today's capital equipment. But this capital equipment is partly due to past expectations. What he's introducing here is a very complex time dynamic. And you'll see that Minsky uses this. Okay? There is a link between the past, the present, and the future through expectations. The amount of capital we have today depends on what our expectations were in the past. The amount of capital we want to produce today depends on our expectations of the future. The expectations of the future determine how much investment will go on today, which determines today's income. Today's income validates decisions we made in the past. We can't tell if it was a good idea to invest in the past until we know what income is today. Okay? So very complex time dynamics that go on in Keynes and in Minsky. All right, he then moves on to saving investment. He's going to reject loanable funds and present a different argument. Sometimes Keynes's arguments are not presented correctly. Sometimes it seems like Keynes is saying saving and investment aren't equal. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that they will be equal. Saving equals investment. Just like in neoclassical theory. The difference is, what is it that makes them equal? In neoclassical theory, it's flexible interest rate. In Keynes, it's income. Income adjusts to make them equal. Okay? So he says, saving is a two-sided affair. It depends on your marginal propensity to save in Keynes, or thrift in the neoclassical theory, but also on your income. And the problem with neoclassical theory is they don't have the second factor, which is income. Okay, that's where they go wrong. Income is a function of employment, okay, which itself is a function of investment. It isn't possible for saving to deviate from investment due to impacts on income. So saving will equal investment, but it's because income adjusts to make sure they're equal. And then, whoops, paradox is spelled wrong. There's a typo. There's a paradox of thrift. He says, an attempt to increase saving through increased thriftiness, which causes you to reduce consumption, actually won't increase saving. Because income will adjust to keep saving the same. So if you try to save more by consuming less, you just end up with less income in the aggregate, so the saving doesn't change at all. He introduces the idea of a propensity to consume. This is pretty much like in the textbooks, so it's not too surprising. There's a relationship between income and consumption. As income goes up, consumption goes up, but by not as much. So the propensity to consume is less than 1. I guess one difference from the modern textbooks is we usually talk about marginal propensity to consume. Keynes just talked about the propensity to consume. So the change of consumption or the change of income is fairly stable and less than 1. As employment and income rise, consumption rises, but by less than the rise of income. That means that we will not have a tendency for supply to create demand. Because as income goes up, consumption doesn't go up by as much. So we open up the possibility that you can have a demand gap, because you want to save some fraction of the increase of income, and that has to be filled by something. So it would require either investment rises to fill the gap or some other kind of spending, something other than consumption. He talks briefly about a sinking fund. So here I just want to relate it to modern debates. In the United States, we have Social Security. And Social Security is run as a sinking fund. What we do is we tax workers and we tax employers, and then the government supposedly sets this aside in a trust fund, and they're going to use it later to take care of retirees in the future as we have an aging society. Okay, so it's a very typical approach. Corporations have sinking funds. They set aside funds to replace capital equipment in the future. Individuals have sinking funds, retirement savings, individual retirement savings. What Keynes says is that these create a demand gap, because if you're setting aside funds to use later, you're not spending them now. So this also breaks Say's law, because you're setting aside a sinking fund. A sinking fund tends to depress the economy. It has to be made up by an injection of some other kind of spending. So Keynes says, society cannot provide for the future consumption by financial expedients, that is, setting aside funds to be used later. Indeed, they only reduce aggregate demand and actually make it harder to take care of people in the future. Sinking funds make it harder to take care of future retirees. You'd be better off not to try to save for the future. Society as a whole can't save in financial terms, is what he's saying. Society as a whole can save only in real terms. Only in real terms, by putting in place capital that can be used in the future to produce the real stuff retirees in the future will need. He uses Kahn's idea of a multiplier. So Kahn had an employment multiplier. He argued that if you increase employment in the investment goods sector, that will increase consumption, because workers in the investment sector need to eat. So they will increase consumption. So Keynes said, well, if we assume that there's a fairly constant relationship between increasing employment and increasing income, then we can talk about an income multiplier. So if we increase employment, which increases income in the investment sector, that will also increase employment and income in the consumption goods producing sector, so we get a multiplier. If the propensity to consume is 0, we don't get a multiplier. If the propensity to consume is equal to 1, then we get explosive growth. Normally, the propensity to consume is between 0 and 1. Okay, and that helps to stabilize the economy. This is usually presented in sort of a mechanical way in the textbooks. Keynes says that this is not purely arithmetic problem. It's actually more complicated because the size of the multiplier will depend on a variety of factors. It goes through those. I won't. I've listed them here. So you shouldn't think of this as, there is a very specific number for the multiplier, that it's 4 or something like that. Keynes says, no, it all depends on a variety of factors. He also says that while the multiplier can take time to work out, investment always equals saving. This might not mean much to you, but 30 years ago there was a debate in the post-Keynesian literature about the time that it takes for the multiplier to work out. Because if we increase investment spending now, we can imagine that that will create demand for more consumer goods, which creates hiring in the consumption sector, which then creates more spending, and so on. And with a propensity to consume that's less than 1, gradually not only is spending going up, but saving is going up. And so that if we had 100 euros investment now, eventually saving will also go up by 100 and investment equals saving. But in between, while the multiplier process is occurring, investment is greater than saving. How can this be true? Keynes said investment always equals saving. Well, Keynes already had explained in the general theory that it's always true. At every point in time, investment equals saving. The multiplier process can take time to work out, but investment always equals saving instantaneously. How can that be true? The answer was inventories. So Keynes explained that if we increase employment in the investment sector, those workers go to the grocery store and they start buying food. They buy it off the shelf. That sends a signal to the food producers. They say, oh, we need to hire more people and produce more food to restock the shelves. If you're buying inventory off the shelves, that is negative investment. Okay? So if investment went up by 100, but you have negative investment, that is selling the stock off the shelves of 100, there's been no net investment at all. Okay, so investment still equals saving. Gradually over time, the producers react, they start restocking the shelves, that counts as positive investment, so that investment will be growing, saving will be growing at the same pace. Okay?
So inventory is like an investment of the distribution, let's say, sector. They have the stock of goods in which they have invested, and by consuming that, it's negative investment, so saving equals investment.
Yes, that's right. So you can read this. If you're interested in that debate, you can go back to Tom Azamakopoulos and then various responses. Okay, and it turns out there was no reason for the debate. It was already in the general theory. You already explained.
Excuse me, for be sure that I understand everything, which is the definition of savings that Keynes gives?
Saving is a residual. To put it another way, saving is the accounting record of investment. They can't be unequal. Okay? That after the fact, when we measure it, investment, which is the spending on capital output, creates income that hasn't been consumed, which is saving. Okay? Now,
May I try to see if I understand? Let us imagine that the producers of consumer goods do not sold all the consumer goods. This increases automatically investment as the stocks of unsold consumer goods. So it's
Yeah.
an idea.
Yeah. So that the inventory part, yeah, by definition, they produce goods that end up on store shelves, that's investment, but it also must represent income that was spent, that was paid out, but not spent on consumer goods. When it's spent, the inventory comes off the shelf, and the investment is negative and the savings is negative.
It's an accounting definition, as we said. It's
And-
not the equality between investment and so-called voluntary savings.
And I skipped over it because we're very short on time, but chapter 6, remember I said Keynes also had to come up with a way to do the accounting for what we now call GDP and gross national income. Okay? Chapter 6, he lays it all out. He had to do it himself because we didn't have the national income and product accounts in 1936. So Keynes explains and he goes through the whole thing and he shows that saving equals investment is an accounting identity. Okay, it's an accounting identity. It falls right out of his equivalent to national income and product accounts. They cannot be unequal.
So, not being an equation, it doesn't say anything actually. It's an identity which.
Well, see, I would say identities must be true, but they can also be extremely informative. The Koleski identity, which we'll talk about. Extremely informative identity. When God leads sectoral balance is an identity. Extremely informative. Okay? So don't dismiss things just because they're identities. We can learn a lot from identities. And identities help us avoid making mistakes. Okay? Because most of what you hear in terms of macro analysis and policy formation is based on mistakes. Okay? Based on mistakes by people who don't understand the identities. So at the very least, you'll avoid a lot of mistakes if you stick to identities. All right. Oh, the last thing here, Keynes says, if there's involuntary unemployment, then the marginal disutility of working is less than the real wage. Okay, so there are people who want to work. He says, so increasing spending can always increase employment. And this is where he makes the very famous statement of, he says, look, if you can't think of anything else to do, you can always reduce unemployment by hiring people to dig holes, having them bury money, and then let the private entrepreneurs hire people to go find the money. You create a lot of employment. And so a lot of people say, oh, look how silly Keynes is. He's recommending something extremely inefficient, hiring people to dig holes. What he actually was saying was that if you have a problem of unemployment caused by lack of effective demand, you can always put them to work to do something. If you're too stupid to think of something better, just hire them to dig holes. You will improve your economy. Okay? Because you will create a market for output. And private entrepreneurs will respond by increasing employment and output. Okay, the next chapter, he provides his theory of investment, where we buy capital equipment not because it's technologically efficient. We buy capital equipment because it's expected to produce a stream of returns in the future. Money returns. You buy capital now to make money later. Okay? Very different from the neoclassical approach, where you're buying capital because It's productive in the sense that it produces real stuff. For Keynes, you buy it because it will give you a prospective yield. You then have to take account of the supply price versus the demand price. The price you must pay to get the capital equipment versus the amount you're willing to pay to get the capital equipment. Okay? So the supply price is the price that would just induce a manufacturer to newly produce 1 unit of a capital output, a capital asset. Sorry. So we'll call that PS. Minsky begins with this, and then he's going to add in finance costs. Okay? But keep this in mind. So it's what do you have to pay in order to get the supplier of capital equipment to supply it to you? That's the supply price. The demand price depends on the Qs you think you're going to get in the future. Okay? So it depends on the prospective yield, but then because those returns are in the future, we need to discount them back to the present. So it's the discounted prospective yield. We compare the demand price to the supply price. Demand price needs to be at least equal to or above the supply price before we will buy the capital equipment. Okay. Then he says that discount rate that will make the demand price equal to the supply price, discounting all the future Qs, makes the demand price equal to the supply price. We will call that the marginal efficiency of capital. So the MEK is the discount rate that just makes the demand price equal to the supply price. There are some complications here I won't go into. It turns out these are sort of two different ways to do it, and they don't always lead to exactly the same answer. If you want to read all about this, read Vicky Chick's 1986 book, I think it is. So he says that as we increase investment, the MEK, marginal efficiency of capital, for that kind of investment will tend to fall. This sounds a bit like the diminishing marginal productivity of capital argument in neoclassical economics, but it's not. Okay? He says it can fall for two reasons. One is that you end up with a congestion of the market. If you buy too many widget-making machines, you produce so many widgets, you depress the price of widgets, which depresses the profitability. Okay? So if you have too much capacity, you will reduce the profitability of that kind of investment. The second one is that you'll come up against bottlenecks in the production of the widget-making machines. So this one, could be related to a diminishing returns argument. But sometimes Keynes is accused of adopting a marginal product of capital approach based on diminishing returns. If you read him carefully, you see it's actually not that at all. He's talking about money returns, not physical productivity of the capital equipment falling. The physical productivity of the capital equipment isn't affected at all. The problem is that you've destroyed the market for widgets because you produce too many of them, or the producers of the capital equipment have to raise the costs to you of providing them because they hit bottlenecks in the supply of skilled labor or something like that. So then he says we can draw a schedule of the MEK, or we can call that investment demand curve, against the interest rate. And we will only invest when the MEK is above the interest rate because we can earn the interest rate on financial assets rather than going to all the trouble and risk and uncertainty of investing in capital equipment. So the MEK must be above the interest rate to induce any investment. So this is the second place where Keynes seems to be using more of a conventional argument. This sounds a bit like supply and demand. Could be interpreted as marginal product of capital, but also it seems to require a nice downward sloping MEK schedule. Okay? And this is problematic, and probably wasn't the best way for Keynes to present his arguments. In chapter 17, which we'll do after the break, he presents a very different way of approaching capital investment as a generalized approach to asset pricing. Okay, so I'll talk about that. Okay, he says that what I'm doing is very different from the neoclassical approach, because in the neoclassical approach, the interest rate is determined by the marginal product of capital plus thrift. You need both of those curves to determine the interest rate. What I am doing is I'm taking the interest rate as being determined somewhere else, and I'm weighing the MEK against the interest rate. He says it would be circular for me to argue that the MEK goes into determining the interest rate, because I need to know the interest rate before I know whether to invest or not. So the MEK is separately determined from the interest rate. The MEK is the rate of discount that makes the supply price equal to the demand price of capital. I weigh that against the interest rate. So I'm not determining the interest rate here. Okay, he makes this very clear, although it's not understood often by people who read Keynes. So he says, that would be a circular claim, and I'm not making that mistake. What affects the MEK? This is important for the borrower's risk and lender's risk, which we'll return to when we look at Minsky. Says that if you have investment and if it is partially financed by borrowing, then we have a borrower's risk and a lender's risk. The borrower's risk is, I don't really know that I'm going to get the profits in the future, but now I'm stuck with a loan I have to make payments on. So there's a risk to me. So I'm going to discount my estimate of what the profits will be to give me a margin of safety. So Minsky uses this in his theory of financial instability. But there's also a lender's risk, and that is the risk to the, let's say, bank, that you will either voluntarily not repay or you cannot repay because your income flow is too low. He says the first one is a real social cost. We can't eliminate it. There's always uncertainty about the future. Even if you use your own money, there's the risk. Okay? The second one adds to the cost of investment, but exists only because the supplier of money, the lender, is different from the investor. So we double count the risk that the profits in the future don't come forth. The second one is not a real social cost. It exists only because we have a system in which the investor may have to borrow the funds. So it double counts the risk and tends to keep investment low. The connection between the future and the present comes mainly through the MEK, not through the interest rate. This will be important for the next chapter. The interest rate is mainly a current phenomenon, while the MEK is very forward-looking into an uncertain, distant future. And so the main problem in our economy is not caused by the interest rate, but by the MEK. And that is important for today's policy making, because everyone thinks that the interest rate set by the central bank is what is so important. So in the United States, we have this debate, should the central bank raise the interest rate or keep it low and so on. Keynes says, that's not the important thing. The important thing is where the MEK is. Okay? Monetary policy is not very important. What is important is the expectations of the entrepreneurs. The MEK is what dominates. Durable equipment is a link between the future and the present. The expectations of the future affects the present through today's demand price for capital, which determines how much investment you get. So the expectations of the entrepreneurs are what, to a very large extent, determine what happens today. And if those expectations are pessimistic, your economy today will be rotten, no matter what the policies All right, chapter 12 for most people is the most fun chapter. This is where he talks about whirlwinds of optimism and pessimism and the stock market and all sorts of fun things. So there are chapter 12 Keynesians and there are chapter 17 Keynesians. The chapter 12 Keynesians focus on this speculation and uncertainty. The chapter 17 Keynesians focus on his theory of asset pricing. He says when we're calculating the demand price to get our MEK, that prospective yield depends on the existing facts that can be more or less known, but also on the future events that cannot be known. So there's a great deal of uncertainty about your long-term expectations. The short-term expectations have to do with using existing capital. Long-term expectations have to do with deciding whether to purchase more capital. It says, because the future is so uncertain, we tend to rely on what is going on today. And then we extrapolate into the future. And this is a convention that if it's strongly held that the future will be like the present, will actually help to stabilize the economy a lot. So if we all proceed as if the future will be like the present, then the future will be a lot like the present. If that convention breaks down, the uncertainty becomes so great that who knows what the future will be like. So he says the convention is to rely on the existing state of affairs, and if we do, there won't be rapid changes of expectations, and therefore it will be fairly safe to do that. However, what has happened, so he's talking about in the early 20th century up to 1929, is that the stock market has come to dominate the economy. We've had a separation of owners from the management of the firms. In the past, we had individuals or partners own their firms. They were in the business of shoemaking or whatever. They operated on the convention that we're not going to have huge changes. What exists today will continue to exist in the future. We don't carefully calculate the possible returns we can get from our own business, but also from all other businesses. Okay, and so it was a fairly stable environment. But what has happened in the past few decades is that the ownership of firms has moved to stockholders who know very little about the business of the firms whose stocks they own. And so their expectations are not firmly held. They will take a bit of news about the prospects for a firm and quickly revise their expectations for that firm. And he gives some examples like ice firms. So the stock of ice firms goes down in the winter because sales are bad. Of course, everyone knows ice sales will be low in the winter, so rational people wouldn't change their portfolio just because it's winter. But if you don't know much about the business of the firm, you see the sales are going down, you want to sell the stock in ice firms. Okay? So with separation of owners and managers, instability has risen, and we get a constant revaluing of the worth of firms and lines of business. The individual's investment has become much more liquid, so it's easy to buy or sell out of positions in firms. But for society as a whole, it's not possible to have liquidity because someone else has to buy the stock that you're trying to sell. So we've got a domination in the stock market by people who know little about the business of the firms. Yes, but why can't professionals make money? Because they know the business of the firms. He gives a variety of reasons as to why it wouldn't make sense for professionals to try to stick to the what we call fundamentals now of the firms. It says, no, even the professionals are going to be involved in speculating, and what they're going to try to do is guess what average opinion thinks. And he says we reach the second or even third degree, where everyone is trying to guess what others think. And he gives examples of the old maid game as an example of what is going on in the stock markets. So we reach a point where speculation dominates enterprise. What he means by speculation is you're buying and selling stocks with a view to avoiding losses on stocks or making profits on stock prices rising. So speculation has to do with forecasting the psychology of the market, while enterprise has to do with trying to estimate the long-term prospects for particular assets. So you always have a little bit of speculation, and it's okay to have some speculation. But when speculation dominates over enterprise, then the capital development of the economy is not going to be very well done. Again, Minsky takes up all of this, especially in the book draft that you have. We reach the point again where speculation dominates over enterprise in the developed capitalist world. Is there anything you can do about it? Keynes is very skeptical that there's much you can do about it. He talks about a Tobin tax, which is the financial transactions turnover tax, but he's doubtful that that's going to be successful, because if you make it high enough, you make stocks illiquid, which then defeats the purpose of a stock market. Yeah.
He talks about an internal Tobin tax, that is the internal stock exchange. Because usually the Tobin tax is,
Okay.
no, just to clarify, otherwise it may be confusing.
Because the external Tobin tax is proposed for two reasons. One is to reduce transactions, the other is to raise money for the government. Okay, and Keynes wasn't advocating that one.
And Keynes assumed a closed economy, actually, in most of the general theory.
Definitely for the financial part of the economy, Keynes said, there's nothing more certain than that finance needs to be domestic.
Yeah.
And so, at least as far as capital flows, yes. All right. I think I'm going to skip over this stuff. Okay, last part before the break is his theory of the interest rate. So he's rejecting loanable funds. The interest rate is not determined by the intersection of investment equals saving, because investment equals saving is determined by income, not by the interest rate. So he needs a theory of the interest rate. Remember, he said the interest rate is not determined when we determine the MEK. We have to weigh the two. So the interest rate has to be determined somewhere else. What is it that determines the interest rate? Chapters 13 and 15, he presents a theory of the determination of the interest rate. Chapter 14, he criticizes the neoclassical view. Okay? However, the best place to understand his theory of the interest rate is chapter 17, not in chapters 13 and 15. Because there's a problem in chapters 13 and 15, which is that he approached this from supply and demand framework, okay, which is flawed, and has led to debates in post-Keynesian literature, and I think some of the criticism of Keynes is well-deserved. It was a mistake to do it this way. Chapters 13 and 15 present Keynes' theory of the interest rate in the way that your textbook probably did. They said, this is Keynes' theory, and it's true, it is in Keynes. It's in chapters 13 and 15. In my view, this really was not Keynes' theory. He was pushed by some of his young colleagues to do it this way, and it was a mistake. However, because it's done that way, I just want to quickly go through it. So he says the neoclassical theory is wrong. Okay, they claim the interest rate is determined by the intersection of thrift and productivity. He said this cannot be true. Thrift has nothing to do with determination of the interest rate. Okay, why? It assumes that thriftiness is a willingness to postpone consumption, and you get rewarded for doing that. He says, but hold it a second. If you postpone consumption by holding money, you don't earn any interest. Okay, here he's defining money fairly narrowly. If you hold cash, there is no interest. Where's the reward? That can't be the explanation for the interest rate, because there is no reward for postponing consumption. You can put cash under your mattress, you get no reward at all. Okay? So he says, they approached it from the wrong way. They thought that there's only one decision. I will save, not consume. But actually, it's a two-step decision. I will decide not to consume, but I also will decide how will I hold my saving. Okay? And it is the second decision that goes into determining the interest rate. How I hold my saving. That influences the interest rate. Deciding to save doesn't. So he says the interest rate doesn't equilibrate saving and investment. It equilibrates the desire to hold wealth in the form of cash against the available quantity of cash. Now, Keynes uses different words to mean the same thing several times in these chapters. He says cash, and he says money. Okay? Then he also says we can define money arbitrarily. Okay, well that can't be true. So when he's saying money and cash, he's meaning very liquid money forms. All right. Then he also says money demand and liquidity preference. He uses the terms interchangeably here. Okay, and I think that was a mistake. Liquidity preference is a preference for liquid assets, but there's a continuum of liquid assets, from the most liquid, which is cash, to very illiquid, which would be machinery. Capital equipment would be very illiquid. Okay, but he does define it fairly loosely. He goes on to talk about why we want to hold money, and he uses the exposition that you've seen in the textbooks. He says there's three motives to hold money. There's a transactions motive, precautionary motive, and speculative motive for holding money. We can assume a negative relation between the interest rate and the quantity of money we want to hold, because there's the opportunity cost. If we hold money, we get less interest. And because as the interest rate declines, you are holding more money because you think the interest rate would rise in the future, and then you get a capital loss on holding bonds. So the lower the interest rate, the more money we're willing to hold. Okay, I'm going very quickly over this. He then moves on to money supply. So what is money? Well, we can draw the line arbitrarily. He talks about the supply of money as if it is supplied exogenously, presumably by the central bank, but he also talks about money as if it is supplied endogenously by private banks. So this whole discussion about the supply of money is somewhat confused and confusing. Many people interpret this as exogenous money, which means a vertical money supply curve, as it's always drawn in the textbooks, facing a downward sloping money demand curve. Intersection gives you the interest rate. Okay, very simple. That's the way it's usually done in textbooks. As you read this, you'll see that it's not so clear that he's really talking about a vertical money supply exogenously fixed by the central bank, but you could interpret it that way. So the conclusion is that classical theory takes the income level as given and investment saving determines the interest rate. Keynes agrees that given a level of income, the current interest rate must be at the point where the demand curve for capital equals the savings curve, but, in other words, investment equals saving. That has to be true. But he denies you can shift the investment curve or the saving curve around like you do in the loanable funds picture while holding income constant. Okay? So it would be true for a given level of income, but it's not true if shifting the saving curve or shifting the investment curve affects the level of income, which he says is almost certainly going to occur. And in fact, he draws a picture. One of the, I think the only picture in the general theory shows that it's indeterminate what will happen to the interest rate if you shift the saving curve or if you shift the investment curve. You don't know what's going to happen to the interest rate because it depends on what happens to the level of income. So the MEK is not determined by the interest rate. That would be circular reasoning. Rather, the MEK is determined partially by the scale of current investment, and we have to know the interest rate in order to determine what that scale will be. He said, in the, now we can skip this, you don't care about the treaties. So I'll stop here. Any questions?
10 hours.
Oh, wait. Any questions first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Today we have a timing
Yeah,
problem.
qual è l'integrazione alimentare?
12:30.
We, in principle, we should close 12:30.
Oh.
Personally, it's always 3 hours. I have no problem in going on. I checked the timing of this room. There will be somebody else at 1.
Oh.
So that's the maximum we have for today. Huh? So if you can wrap up, otherwise I have no problem in beginning tomorrow with my very quick part, then questions, then we go on. That's the point.
Okay, take a break. The general theory later on your own, such as this one. There's more information than we need here. He's contrasting his approach to capital against the neoclassical approach, where, according to the neoclassical approach, saving is postponed consumption, and reducing consumption today doesn't affect employment or output as a whole, because reducing consumption today is a decision to consume tomorrow. And if you're consuming tomorrow, you go ahead and order what it is you're going to consume tomorrow. So anyone who loses their job producing goods to be consumed today can get a job producing goods to be consumed tomorrow. So we stay at full employment. Okay? So in other words, you go directly from producing consumer goods to producing investment goods. He says, while that view is universal, it's absurd. So Keynes has a nice phrasing. It's an absurd idea. A decision to not consume today, even if it is a decision that I'll consume tomorrow, is not placing an order for what you will consume tomorrow. You're going to postpone that decision until later. You may consume tomorrow, you don't know what you're going to consume, or you may choose not to consume tomorrow. So a decision not to consume today is not a decision to consume tomorrow that could motivate any producers to produce stuff to produce tomorrow. All right? It says, furthermore, the orthodox view of capital is that it earns a return because it's productive. Again, this is an absurd idea, according to Keynes. It says, Austrians assume our claim is due to roundaboutness. Capital gets a return because the production process is more roundabout if it involves capital. And the more roundabout, the greater the return needs to be in order to reward the producers who choose an ever more roundabout production process. Keynes says, capital doesn't get a return due to productiveness or roundaboutness. He says we might as well argue it gets a return due to smelliness. Okay, so again, making fun of the orthodox approach. Then he gives an example. I won't go through it in great detail, but he says that really the argument about roundaboutness makes sense only where there's a special case where individuals want to consume tomorrow but not today. Then it makes sense to engage in a roundabout production process that takes time so that the consumer goods will be produced when people are ready to buy them. Then you would choose a roundabout production process. But otherwise you don't choose roundabout production processes to produce output. So you don't need a reward to roundaboutness. Okay? So what really is the inducement to invest? It is because of the prospective yield in the future. And the yield is monetary, it's not real production. So you invest to get money in the future. If capital is not sufficiently scarce, the MEK will tend to fall towards zero. So we'll come back to this at the very end of the book in chapter 24, where he argues that keeping capital scarce increases the reward to capital. And we are keeping capital too scarce. And what we need to do is to reduce the scarcity of capital, which will reduce its reward, but that will be fine if we lower interest rates and keep them lower. So I'm going to skip over this. You can read this slide and compare it to the general theory. There's this very nice quote about the fate of Midas. He says that in a way we suffer from an abundance in wealthy societies. If we were poorer and had less capital and were less productive, then we could enjoy higher investment, higher employment, and higher income until capital became less scarce. And then we stop investing and have high unemployment and low economic growth because we're too rich. So he says what they did in the old days was they built pyramids. They kept people busy building pyramids. And so unless we can find a solution where the rich can be content to build mansions and pyramids, we suffer the fate of Midas. We could use government to take over this role of keeping the population employed by building public infrastructure investments and thereby closing demand gaps. Okay, chapter 17, Keynes presents an alternative exposition of his theory of the interest rate. And it is presented as a theory of asset pricing. As I said, there are chapter 12 Keynesians and chapter 17 Keynesians. So as just a little bit of a diversion, I want to explain the difference between the two. There are some economists who think that chapter 12 is the key chapter of the general theory. It focuses on the formation of long-term expectations about an extremely uncertain future, where the expectations are subject to wild fluctuation, waves of optimism and pessimism, where the idea of equilibrium is nonsense, okay? Because you have all of this wild fluctuation. Then you have chapter 17 Keynesians, who focus on the exposition in this chapter, which is based on a notion of equilibrium. Keynes actually adopts an equilibrium methodology in chapter 17. It's not the neoclassical approach to equilibrium, it's a different one. But what we're trying to do is determine the level of income and employment at a point in time. It's the intersection of the D and Z curves. That's an equilibrium point. Okay? So the two chapters are very different. One, all this instability, and the other is equilibrium. So there are three main approaches to Keynes. The first is the orthodox, the Keynesian, the textbooks, TK stands for textbook Keynesian, or the Koleskian, where the argument is what's important about the general theory is the theory of effective demand and the multiplier. Then there is the chapter 12 Keynesians, who follow people like Shackle, where it's all about uncertainty. And there's no equilibrium, there's just instability. Then finally, there is the what's called fundamentalist Keynesian. Davidson came up with that term. Chapter 17 Keynesianism, which is Davidson, Craig-Ominski, where there is an equilibrium methodology that's adopted, but it's not neoclassical. So what it is a theory of shifting equilibrium, where you have an equilibrium associated with each set of expectations. When expectations change, you get a different point of equilibrium. So we already said before, we have expectations on the vertical axis. Every time the expectations change, these curves shift, and we get a different point of equilibrium. Okay. So that's what chapter 17 is all about. So here, what he's doing is presenting a different theory of the interest rate, but it's much more general than that. Keynes argues that anything you can hold through time has a price. Okay? It has an asset price. And that asset price is determined by the expected yields, total return that you can get from holding that asset. Okay? So not only is there a return to lending money, okay, so you get a return on loans, but there's an expected return you can get on holding anything through time. There's an expected return to capital, so we already did that in this chapter on capital. That's the expected future yield. There's a return to holding wheat. Okay, if you hold wheat to sell tomorrow, there's an expected return on that. There's a return to holding Rembrandt paintings. Anything you can hold through time has an expected return. So he generalizes interest rate theory to apply it to anything that you can hold through time. And he actually developed this theory working with Sraffa when they were playing in commodities markets. Sraffa and Keynes came up with this idea that commodities have an own rate of return. So if you're speculating in commodities, there's an expected return to holding commodities that you will sell in the future. So he generalized that beyond commodities to anything you can hold in time, hold through time, including financial assets and real capital. So to understand why the forces of the economy are not directed toward achieving a market clearing equilibrium, he says the problem is that there is some asset that has a liquidity premium greater than its carrying cost, and that asset will tend to set a barrier to further production. That asset tends to be money. So money has special characteristics that give it the greatest return in excess of carrying cost, which then sets a barrier to the returns on all other assets. And that will generally occur before you reach full employment, and that is why we have unemployment. So he begins by presenting the own rate of interest theory. Every durable commodity has an own rate of interest determined in terms of itself. I'm going to skip over this part. We can measure that own rate of return in terms of money, and there's reasons why we should use money to measure that own rate of interest. Because money is a special asset, which we'll get to in just a second. Money will be what he calls the rooster that rules the roost, and that's why we measure the own rate of interest of everything you can hold through time in money terms. Okay. There are three attributes of an asset. Some produce a yield. Okay, he calls this Q. If you think of a bond, you can hold a bond, and the bond promises to pay you a yield every year. That's its yield. You can hold a savings account, a deposit in your bank. It promises to pay you an interest rate through time. That's a Q. You can hold a factory, and that has an expected return from producing automobiles that you're going to sell. That's a Q. Anything you can hold through time will have a Q. Okay? Well, almost anything you can hold through time will have a Q. Most of those have a carrying cost, C. If you hold wheat, the carrying cost is some of it goes rotten, the rats eat some of it, that's a carrying cost. If you hold a factory, you have upkeep. You have to keep the factory in good shape. That's a C. If you hold cash, the C is very small. Okay, maybe you have to rent a safety deposit box at your bank, or maybe you have to have a vault in your house. That's the C. Okay, and then finally, many assets can be sold fairly quickly without much of a loss. That's liquidity, L. Okay, a factory has very little L. They're hard to sell without a big loss. If you have a Ford Motor Company factory, okay, it's built to produce Fords, so it's hard to sell. If you have stock in the stock market, that's very liquid, easy to sell. You might get a loss, because it depends on what the price is when you sell. If you have cash, it's perfectly liquid. You can immediately use it, sell it for something, right? With no loss. So cash is the most liquid. It has the highest L. The other end of the spectrum, factories, very illiquid, hard to sell. In between, we have lots of other stuff. Bonds, stocks, savings accounts, certificates of deposit, and so on. Okay? So, we can measure the total return as Q minus C plus L. Take the total return. And the key point here is that each different type of asset that you hold through time gets its total return in different proportions from the Q, from the C, and from the L. At the capital equipment end of the range, the return comes from the Q minus C. There's no L. At the highly liquid end of the range, cash has no Q. You don't get a return from holding cash. The C is very low, nearly zero. The return comes from L. Okay? So the essential property of money is it has a high L, hardly any C. So L minus C is the greatest as compared to any other asset. All right? So money gets its return mostly due to L. Then money has special properties. The first is that it has a small elasticity of production. This is what Keynes calls it, and it's confusing. What he means is that as the price of money goes up, the desire for liquid assets rises. You don't devote labor to produce more money. Labor is not produced by money. That's a key point. Okay? So labor is not farmed out of the ground or picked off trees or produced in factories. Okay? Money is just an IOU. It involves virtually no labor in its production.
Excuse me, what you mean here with price of money exactly?
It's the L is the return you're getting from money. Okay, and so it is what you can get for money. And as money becomes ever more desirable, okay, think about you're in the Great Depression. What can you get for money? You can get a lot for money because the price of everything has fallen
So
relative to money.
basically we can say that is kind of level of prices, unit of a kind.
And so the price of money is going in the reverse direction of everything else. So as you have massive deflation, the price of money is going up and up and up relative to everything else.
That's very
Okay? The second is the elasticity of substitution for money is nearly zero. What this means is that when liquidity preference is really high and you really want money, nothing else will satisfy you. Okay? And so as the value of money is going up, everything else is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but you don't want anything else. You still demand more money. And finally, as the quantity of money rises, its own rate doesn't fall very much. It still has L. No matter how much there is, it still has L. And the carrying cost is extremely low. That's different from other commodities. Just think about, what if the quantity of wheat goes up and up and up and up and up? Its Q goes down. Okay, the expected proceeds from selling wheat is going to go down. Its carrying cost goes up and up and up because you got to store it. You got to rent big silos to store all the wheat. Okay, so the carrying cost goes up, and its liquidity is not very high. So money is very different from other assets. As you produce more of other kinds of assets, their total return tends to go down. As you produce more of money, its return doesn't tend to go down. Okay, or it goes down more slowly than for anything else. So the combination of these things means that money will tend to be the rooster whose return dominates over anything else. If you produce more and more widget-making machines, the total return from producing another widget-making machine will go down. Why? Because the Q's decline. You spoiled the market for widgets. You're producing too many widgets. So another widget machine is not very useful. And they're not liquid, and they have a carrying cost. You've got to keep them in good shape. So as you produce more widget-making machines, the expected total return goes down. As you produce more money, the expected return doesn't go down much. So as we provide more and more of all other kinds of assets, their returns go down, but the return to money doesn't go down. And so those returns are falling, the return to money is not falling, and we reach the return to money, and that stops the production of any other kind of asset. All right?
Except in a hyperinflation situation, which the stock of money.
If Keynes does argue that we do need some stickiness in money prices in order for money to rule the roost. And at the end of this chapter, he says, there have been times when the most liquid thing was not money. Okay, and hyperinflation could be an example. He says in the past, perhaps land at some points was more liquid than money was. Yes. So it doesn't have to be money, he's just saying usually it is money. There will be some asset that has an L minus C greater than all others. Most of the time that asset is money. But not always. Hyperinflation would be an example.
As the demand for money increases, then we can say perfectly that money, we can supply more money.
We can supply more money, but the problem is it doesn't take labor. So we don't want to produce any more machinery, so all those workers lose their jobs. There would be no problem if they could get jobs producing money, because that's what people want. The problem is there are no jobs involved in creating money, or very few of them.
I think that probably Keynes would say that even with the gold as money, the elasticity of production of money is so low that the same effect.
Keynes had a debate with Hayek about this because the usual argument was, but hold a second, if we're on the gold standard, all the people who lose their jobs can go be gold miners, okay? And Keynes did concede that if we had gold very, very widely distributed around the world, so that it was feasible to get jobs, that this would play a positive role in reducing unemployment, okay? Now, when we get to MMT, you're going to see that I'm going to dispute this view of the gold standard. It never worked this way, okay? But
anyhow, the elasticity of production was very low, so actually the effect would not be there. That was one of the problems of the gold standard. That was relatively inelastic.
because gold is not evenly distributed and it's not, you know, where the unemployed people are, so it actually doesn't create many jobs. Okay. And Keynes also made an argument that if the elasticity of production, this first item here, if it wasn't extremely low, that asset would not be money. If labor was used in the production, you wouldn't choose that one to be money. It's very important that it's not producible by labor, okay? And that's why gold never was money. Even on a gold standard, gold was never money, okay? So he conceded too much to Hayek. Let me see. He says a monetary economy is one where you have some asset, doesn't necessarily have to be money, that has an L minus C that's greater than zero. A non-monetary economy is one where there isn't any asset like this. In that case, you can't have unemployment. All right? This is where he says the land might be an example. Without money or an asset like money, then production would proceed to the point of full employment. So there's another famous quote, page 235, where he says, unemployment exists because men want the moon is money. And the problem is that men cannot be employed to produce money. If they could, we would not have unemployment. So it's very important that we have this asset that can't be produced by labor, and that asset will be the barrier to full employment. That means the barrier to full employment is not sticky wages. It's not minimum wage laws. It's not unions. The barrier to full employment is money. Okay, this is Keynes' argument. Making wages flexible will not solve the problem. Getting rid of labor unions will not solve the problem. Lowering wages will not solve the problem. The problem is money. If you have money, you will have unemployment. So the solution would, and one solution would be, get rid of monetary economies. If you got rid of the monetary economy, you wouldn't have unemployment. You do not have unemployment in economies that don't have money. Okay, that's a theoretical statement, but it's also an empirically true statement. You don't find unemployment in tribal society. You don't find unemployment in feudal society. You don't find unemployment in modern nunneries, monasteries. They don't have unemployment. You don't find unemployment in slave societies. Okay? You only find unemployment in economies that are organized around monetary production. I think, well, maybe this is interesting.
Well, just if I can. But so there is kind of strong implication in that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also in the classical, when they start talking, also Marx. I don't know Marx really well, so don't hit me if I say something wrong. But when you start talking about like production and value theory and how value is produced, and then somehow, I mean, somehow you have money that just like incarna, put in meat, I don't know, incorporate this value. These are a strong connection, don't you think, with the interpretation of the value theory?
You wrote a wonderful paper published in 1998 and presented in 1994 in a book. Minsky was there, and he was also a discussant. Marxian Economics and Reprisal is the book, I think first volume, and he connected Marx labor theory of value with, let us say, Keynes Minsky approach.
Yeah,
So it can be done. And it was
can
done
be.
by a guy named Dudley Dillard before, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. Very
Yes.
much in the 50s, I think.
Yeah, Dillard wrote the first full exposition of the general theory that I know of, anyway. But Dillard was an institutionalist who was also very familiar with Marx, and so he sort of synthesized Marx and Keynes from 1948, and argued that both of them had a labor theory of value. Now, labor theory of value in Marx plays a number of roles, some of which are not in Keynes at all. Okay, the class society, all that, that's not part of Keynes's analysis. But
Well, in the treatise of money, one may say that they are not far. Keynes didn't know,
But in any case, I think if we define the labor theory of value pretty narrowly and talk about the units of measurement, it's very clear in Keynes. He used the same unit of measurement for the same reason. Okay, we need something that can measure heterogeneous kinds of output and inputs, and labor hours is the best way to do that. But also, the theory of effective demand, the consumption and investment, the way we have two departments, is also very similar to Marx. There's a good paper by Van Hoon, and I cannot remember the date right now, an early paper that shows you can map Keynes's argument to Marx's argument 1-to-1. Okay.
It's even translated in Italian. It's another paper, right?
Oh, yes. But the year escapes me right now.
Even Larry Klein, who got a Nobel Prize, he wrote this book, The Keynesian Revolution, and he was a communist when he did the PhD, and there is a section mapping Marx and Keynes.
Yeah. But this is very controversial. Most post-Keynesians don't accept the labor theory of value, don't want to see it in Keynes, and in fact, many would deny you need any theory of value. Now, I personally think this is a mistake. I think you need several theories of value. So I think you need labor theory of value. Liquidity preference theory is a theory of value. It's how you value financial assets. Labor theory of value is not useful for that because labor is not involved in the production of financial assets. Okay, so you need that. And then the institutionalists have a different one, which is instrumental value theory. And I think you need that one too. So I have no problem saying you need a variety of theories of value. Even utility theory of value is okay for some things. I would not do what the neoclassicals do with it, but I think there's nothing wrong with analyzing the satisfaction you get from consuming output, which would be actually more applicable to non-capitalist economies, where it's, if you describe what you do in a tribal society, you get utility from some activities, and it's not so bad, right?
What is funny is that what you say is in Marx. because the last point is simple circulation, C, M, C prime. The first part, of course, it was very, very crude, because when it was written, when it was writing, but the part about liquidity, preference, etc., has something to do with what Marx says in the third book, and fictitious capital, and liquidity preference has to do with the situation of hoarding, that was called this way, treasuries and hoarding. Of course, on some things it was very true. It is, I would be less gentle than you about effective demand, because it is there in Marx, but I don't think he had the distinction between autonomous demand, like investment driving the whole process. It's implicit. You can get it from it, and then you have to go through Luxembourg to Kaleski to get that. You need to read Marx in a certain way and not in another one which is legitimate. That's it. But that's another thing altogether, as Monty Python would say.
Okay, so I will only quickly go through the slide just because VIXL has become so popular among central bankers now. And this idea of a natural rate of interest, they're all trying to achieve. Because Keynes said in the treatise on money, I had defined a unique interest rate or natural rate that equated saving and investment, and that was similar to VIXL, okay? Where you have a natural interest rate that stabilizes prices. But he says, actually, now I realize there's a different natural rate for every different level of employment. For every level of employment, there is a natural interest rate at which saving equals investment. It's not the interest rate that is equilibrating them, it is the level of income that equilibrates them. But that interest rate is natural in the sense that the MEK met that interest rate, and that's what gave us that level of investment and that level of income. But there's only one unique natural rate at which you get full employment. Let's call that the neutral rate. Okay? So he modifies his exposition in the treatise and also the VIXLian idea. So there's nothing really natural about the neutral rate. It's a sheer coincidence to reach the neutral rate. There are an infinite number of natural rates, and all but one of those are natural for some different level of unemployment. Only one of them is natural for full employment. And the neoclassicals just assume you will be at the full employment level. Natural rate.
Ask something.
Yeah.
If you have multiple equilibria, so multiple full employment, every...
No. Only one is full employment. Multiple equilibria.
No, according to Kaleski's model. Let's say you have a high wage full employment, which is unstable, and a low wage full employment, which is somehow stable. And each of them, according to this model, corresponds to a neutral interest rate, or not. We're taking only the stable type of...
Each one can. Yeah. We aren't really saying whether this one is stable or not. It will be stable depending on expectations.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if it's a full employment one, whether it's high wage or low wage, it's a neutral rate. All right, chapter 18, I won't go through all this, but here he summarizes the whole general theory. So chapter 18 is a good summary where he goes through the arguments where, given the independent variables, which are the MPC, the propensity to consume, the MEK, and the interest rate, then those will determine the level of employment and output, the dependent variables. Investment gets pushed up to the point where the MEK equals the interest rate, then there could be no more investment. That gives you the point of effective demand. This addresses the stability point. Okay, the system may or may not be stable. So this effective demand point may not be a stable one at all. The stability depends on a number of conditions. Is the MPC greater than 1 but not very big? Is MEK extremely responsive to the interest rate? So in other words, does investment really respond greatly to the changes of the interest rate? Does a change of employment lead to a big change of wages? If investment has been above normal, does it tend to revert back to the mean, or does it continue higher? All of those things will help to determine how stable or unstable the system is. So it does not need to be a stable point of equilibrium at all. It depends on all these factors. And he says that generally what we observe in the real world is that the conditions are more or less met. So that we do oscillate, but he says, but we avoid the gravest extremes, except occasionally. Like the Great Depression is a case where we didn't avoid the gravest extreme. I'll do this one very quickly too. Are flexible wages the answer to unemployment? The answer is no. They will not solve the unemployment problem. He then goes on to analyze in what conditions is a reduction of wage likely to lead to more employment. Okay? And you can imagine, what would have to be the case. If a reduction of wages makes firms more optimistic, it's probably going to lead to more employment. If it makes them more pessimistic because they think, uh-oh, my sales are going to be hurt, it's not going to lead to more employment. Okay? If lowering wages makes your country more competitive against the rest of the world, it could lead to more employment. Okay? So he goes through all of these, and he says, our best hope is that a falling nominal wage will raise the MEK, so that means makes firms more optimistic, or lower the interest rate by lowering money demand. Because if your wage is lower, your transactions demand for money is lower, which could lower the interest rate. The best case for raising the MEK is a one-time decline in the wage. Why is that? Because if employers think wages will continue to decline for a long time, first, they worry about their sales in the future, so they don't want to invest. Second, they say, why not wait till wages go down to increase employment? But if they say, oh, it's a one-time drop, let's take advantage of it, and they won't continue to fall, then it might encourage investment. The best case for lowering the interest rate is if the quantity of money is fixed. Okay? So Keynes doesn't assume that it is, but he says if it is, then it will lower the wage. Okay? But then he says, hold it a second. Monetary policy is the best answer then, not flexible wages. Flexible monetary policy is the best answer. Lower the interest rate with monetary policy. That's better than cutting wages and hoping that that lowers money demand and that that lowers the interest rate. Just lower the interest rate. Don't cut wages. So he says, an increase of money supply to lower the interest rate is easier, more uniform to implement, doesn't increase the debt burden, doesn't negatively influence the MEK, so only an unjust, foolish, inexperienced person, Austrians, would prefer flexible wages over flexible money policy. Use monetary policy, not busting wages, as the answer to unemployment. Okay, so the best policy is a stable money wage with a flexible exchange rate and monetary policy lowering interest rates. In chapter 19, he introduces the employment function. This is an analog to the D&C curve exposition, where we have a employment function that relates effective demand measured in the wage unit to the amount of employment, the supply price of output of which will compare to that amount of effective demand. Remember, he started the general theory with the labor market, which looked like the neoclassical labor market. Okay? The problem with that is that it must take the level of output as fixed when you draw the labor demand and labor supply curves. Okay? But now we know the amount of output cannot be taken as fixed. It's determined by the point of effective demand. So we actually cannot use those labor market demand and supply curves, because the demand for labor depends on what you think output will be. It's not fixed. Okay? And so he realizes that he has to have a different approach to determining the quantity of labor and the effect, the possible effect on wages and on prices. So he provides employment functions. And the short story here is that it turns out that your labor demand function can be downward sloping, it can be upward sloping, it can be horizontal. Okay? There is no determinate relationship between the real wage, and the amount of labor employed, because it depends on the effect on income and therefore sales. So Davidson wrote a very famous piece in the 60s on this, and it's in all of his textbooks, which proves graphically that the labor supply function can easily be upward sloping, which means as you raise wages, total employment actually goes up. And it's because of the effective demand effect. You pay higher wages, workers have more income, they can consume more, that encourages firms to increase production.
You wrote this also with Sidney Weintraub, I think.
Yeah. So even when he was a professor, before he was a professor, they were working on this. Okay? So the second thing is there's no necessary reason why increasing employment will cause prices and wages to go up. It depends on the where the demand is directed and whether you're at full employment or not. So Keynes argues that normally it is true that as you increase aggregate demand, prices will go up. Okay? And that is because some of the increased demand will be directed to sectors of the economy that have a low elasticity of production, where they can't increase production very much, so they raise prices. All right? So we have different elasticities there, and depending on where the increased demand goes, you can hit bottlenecks in some areas. Some areas can easily expand output without raising prices, but others can't. So prices will generally rise. He says that's not true inflation. Okay? And this is not something you should ever fight against. True inflation occurs when you're at full employment. At full employment, the elasticity of production goes to zero. You can't increase production because there's no more workers to hire. At true employment, you get true inflation. At full employment, you get true inflation. That you should fight against.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you do it? You need to lower aggregate demand in order to avoid going beyond full employment.
And so why you have to fight this kind of inflation to Keynes? Why is it so bad?
Because you need relative stability in terms of the wage unit. Okay?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a relative stability. If all the prices goes up at the same time,
they won't all go up at the same time, is the problem. You will have some prices rising more than other prices depending on the ability to raise your price and to bid labor away from others.
But which is the so big social cost of this phenomena?
It would depend on what the inflation rate is, okay? But the problem is that you may not be able to solve any of the problems by having prices rise because you're at full employment. So rising prices just means that you're all bidding for labor that doesn't exist.
They are bidding for labor and doesn't exist.
I mean, you're bidding for labor that's already employed. And so you're going to be bidding up wages. So let's say you have a sector of the economy that is highly oligopolized, so they can pass along all the prices. So they're gladly willing to bid higher and higher for wages. So you've got wages going up, they're raising prices, the wages can go up more, and the wage price spiral can
Yeah,
begin.
but to me, saying like this is neutral.
It's what?
Neutral.
If it is all simultaneous at the same time, you are in a closed economy.
But then,
Since here you have an economy in which I think the contracts are made in nominal terms, it becomes very, very difficult to avoid.
yeah, but then my point is what Keynes said. It's not like what we said. You see? No, but I mean, no.
That's true.
What Keynes?
Keynes was not worried about creeping inflation, or what we call creeping inflation, that is gradually rising prices. That's true. That's clear. He thinks that's normal. And he thinks it's generally a good thing. It reduces the debt burden. So slowly rising prices is fine. And there were examples of hyperinflation. He's clearly thinks that's a problem. In between the two, he's not really writing about that.
Okay.
There, at the time, the greater fear was deflation. But
That is how to pay for the war, but that's...
in practice, full employment times were war times. Okay, and then inflation is a problem because what the government is trying to do is to move the resources to the government sector. And you get to full employment, you have sectors of the economy that can bid against the government. And they're willing to bid higher wages in order not to lose labor. The government needs the labor to be in the war industries. And, one solution is you just go ahead and bid against it, and really there's no limit to how high the wages and prices can go. The governments, whether they should be or shouldn't be, are always worried about the budget. Okay? So what you're talking about is the budget is ever expanding and growing with the rate of inflation plus the rate of growth of the war effort, and they don't want that to happen. So they will fight the inflation. How do they fight it? Well, it would be irrational to raise interest rates, right, the normal thing to do, but they will impose taxes, and that is to prevent inflation. Most people say it's so they can pay for the war. Okay, Keynes knew that wasn't true. It's not to pay for the war. It's to fight inflation. They can put on wage and price controls, and they can put on rationing. So usually you do all three.
So, okay, but backing from the Keynes, thinking, you said that he talked about hyperinflation, about like stability price, nothing from between the two. And by the way, do we have any case of hyperinflation caused by a rise in aggregate demand? Like, no.
I would say the answer to that one is no. And the number of experiences of full employment without war is also going to be vanishingly small. So it's not something he really worried about. Keynes thought the normal situation is substantial unemployment. Okay, so again, he's not that worried about full employment inflation, except in war. So in war, we basically know what you have to do, and governments usually do those things. The only other way you're going to get full employment is through something like Chapter 24, which is government policy. But again, it's not sensible for the government to drive demand beyond full employment. So from that perspective, I think the shorter answer to your question is, if you have full employment type of inflation, which is called true inflation, probably the government did it. Okay, and that's not a good public policy. So you want to do something like either limit government spending or impose taxes or rationing or wage and price controls or direct demand toward increasing capacity or importing in order to fight inflation.
Why just not decreasing how the state change prices currency? I mean,
Prices, currency.
exactly with the definition of price that you gave before, like it changed. See?
Yeah, so you're saying that government taking a bigger role in trying to control prices.
No, I'm trying not. Just like if normally government is raising the salary of public sector, well, in order to stabilize price, why just not decrease them?
Yeah, or hold them constant.
Hold them constant.
They're doing that all over
Which
Europe.
is different than rising taxes.
Oh, yeah. So if the government is a big employer, holding wages constant in the government sector will help. That's true.
Also, and if it's little, no. You think it doesn't work?
If the government is little, it's not going to have a big impact. You know, it's not a long-term solution because in the long term, what happens? You lose the good employees to the private sector, and you end up with the people who you probably don't want to employ.
Yeah, but for price issue, I mean, that surprised me. You answer me like this.
Well,
But maybe I will understand more deeply which are your reasons.
I think that
You think he's not deeply answering you?
No, I mean, no, I didn't say
It's a
that.
joke.
My understandable. You see?
let's say that Keynes is a dove on inflation, not a hawk. Okay? So we want relative stability in terms of the wage unit, but it's relative stability. It's not absolute stability. It's okay for wages to go up.
If I may, I don't know if I'm going in your direction, but I think, leaving aside what Keynes really thought, that some inflation may be good because there is something called hysteresis. So actually, this supply may grow if there is some inflation. How much some is may be debated. For sure, creeping inflation was okay. Keynes lived in a world in which inflation was normal in some periods, but in other periods there was deflation. Then, point is, what is a normal inflation? I think there was a book by a Latin American Herman who worked with the Asian food. It turned out that there are no really serious damages for inflation below 50%. Maybe you can be more conservative, but there is a lot to go. 50,
Turkey in the 80s has 80% of
after
inflation.
is hyperinflation, and it may be whatever. Hyperinflation is due to the fact that it happens usually after a war, etc. So you have an excessive aggregate demand because aggregate supply
that's
is
fine.
going down.
No, but that's
it is
fine.
being cut dramatically.
That's
So there is room for debate there.
I think Alcina, neoclassicals also said about 40%. Up to about 40%, there's no evidence that it depresses demand. Are we out of time?
I think we should be
Okay.
kicked out by somebody. They are not here. So,
No, we can stop. We're
so if,
over.
if you
About three
stop,
quick topics we can do tomorrow.
if you stop, what we will do tomorrow is end up quickly the topics we will do today. I will do something no more than 15 minutes. Then you have some time for questions about the first day, but please take them compact. And then we go with the second lecture.
Are you uploading the slides on the event?
I will put the slides today in the afternoon on Moodle. The only thing is that tomorrow, I remind you that the lecture will be 2:30 for 3 hours. I think we then should be relatively free in the room.
Yeah.
But of course, human resistance. Huh?
We'll finish.
Okay.